Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending on where in the world you're dialing from. My name is Daniel Cooperman. I am a director of product marketing here at Snowflake, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. So welcome to these Snowflake office hours with Drizly, which is the world's largest alcohol marketplace and the best way to shop beer, wine, and spirits. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll spend time talking with Dennis Hume and Ian Macomber. And Dennis leads analytics, data engineering at Drizly. Before that, Dennis worked in Chicago at a finance startup called Pangea, building out their data pipelines and optimizing their compliance systems for fraud detection. And Ian leads the analytics teams at Drizly. So think BI, data science, data engineering. Ian previously worked at Wayfair on their recommendations and pricing algorithms, and he started his career there as a BI analyst out of undergrad. Ian also interned at Zillow on their buyers agents auction marketplace. Super interesting resume, Ian. So as the event proceeds, please feel free to type all your questions into your Q&A panel on the On24 dashboard that you should see here on the screen. At the end of the event, we're going to make sure to leave time for me to then ask your questions to both Ian and Dennis. And please ask any and all questions. Nothing is off limits. This webinar is also being recorded, and it's going to be made available later on, and you'll be able to see that on our YouTube channel. Now, without further ado, let me hand it off to Ian and Dennis. You guys can take over.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Can everyone hear me okay? Daniel, can you confirm on your end?
Yes, I can hear loud and clear.
Awesome. And I think I have control over the slides as well. So like Daniel just said, Drizly is the leader in alcohol e-commerce, and we have sort of this hub and spoke model where the liquor stores themselves hold all of our inventory. So sort of unlike some of the other players, we never hold our own inventory, and we also never sort of actually do our own deliveries. It's super important for us to kind of stay away from that from a legal perspective, which means that we have a lot of problems that are kind of like very, very specific to this highly regulated alcohol industry. So what I'm going to do is just sort of give everyone an overview of Drizly's data team and sort of the stuff that we work on. And then halfway through, Dennis is going to trade off and talk a lot more about sort of how we've used and benefited from Snowflake in the last piece. So like I said, we are a three-sided marketplace. So unlike a Postmates and Grubhub, who sort of just work with maybe a Chinese food store and a customer to facilitate an order, we also have these massive retailers. So for example, a liquor store might not care that much if they sell Bud Light or Miller Lite. A customer might not care that much if they purchase Bud Light or Miller Lite. But the retailer cares tremendously. So that would sort of be like the third player in our marketplace is Miller Coors or InBev. So these really, really deep-pocketed players. And other than that, it's like a pretty simple business model where very similar to Postmates, Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub, we partner with a lot of mom and pop stores all the way to sort of massive alcohol chains to get people what they're looking for in under 60 minutes. So here's largely how I'd consider kind of grouping the four buckets of products for Drizly Analytics. So we have a product. So just like anyone else who has a website and an app, we care about optimizing those things on, all the sort of normal spectrums that everyone else looks at. So click-through rate, conversion rate, if someone makes it to a product page, do they add it to their funnel? And then similar to how Uber and Lyft both have a consumer app and a retailer app, we have the same thing. So in addition to our consumer-facing offerings, we also have to maintain a retailer app and website as well so that they can facilitate deliveries on our end. Also very similar is, our analytics team cares about marketing. This is not really anything specific to Drizly, But to a large extent, we care about, what channels and campaigns are working to drive new buyers. What are they worth? Things like lifetime value, cost of acquisition, thinking about having to be intentional with tests, things like that. Where it starts to get a little bit different for us is kind of like I was talking about. Drizly's coverage is hyper-local in nature. So unlike, for example, a Wayfair where I used to work, where you can kind of send a blender anywhere in the US in 2 days, and even unlike Lyft, where if, part of Boston is not covered and part of it is, you can move the drivers around. Our coverage is truly block by block, which means when you pull out your phone and try to place a Drizly order, we need to know which stores cover you at that time, what those stores have in inventory, which can be really tough, and then what you would like. So our recommendation algorithms have to take sort of all of this into account in real time, which is pretty tough. And then finally, the last piece for us is strategic partnerships. And honestly, this is a bit of a greenfield project for us. We have, our consumer marketplace that everyone understands pretty well, but figuring out how to partner with sort of the Diageos and Miller Coors and Anheuser-Busch's of the world, we don't really have a ton of playbooks to copy off of. So to a large extent, we're kind of building it out in real time. So we're thinking about things like merchandising. How do you control how your product shows up on Drizly's site? We're thinking about data offerings. Due to sort of the 3-tier regulatory nature of alcohol, we have such better visibility than anyone else does into sort of who is doing what. We would almost consider our site to be a digital walk through the liquor store. And then finally, we do a lot of collaborative marketing. So thinking things like, how would we work with Bacardi to drive people to the Bacardi section of Drizly's website, for example. So those are kind of the loose buckets that our analytics team would work on. So again, here's some product stuff. So you can sort of see what will I have here. You can see some of my past purchases. You can see that for an individual store level, we have maybe 2 stores that appear. This one might be high demand due to the fact that it's Friday night. And then I just kind of want to emphasize that, selling things online is sort of very different, where if you're thinking about Bud Light and White Claw, you know exactly what you're getting. So you don't necessarily need reviews to tell you that, versus something like Whistle Pig Rye 10 Years, a really expensive whiskey or bourbon. So that's one where having a really positive product experience matters a lot more. On the marketing side of things, here's what I was alluding to. A lot of our advertising looks like this. And obviously, times are pretty crazy with COVID right now. But that has been sort of like another rising tide for us, just getting more people aware that you can actually get alcohol delivered, which is something that not everyone knows. Our hyperlocal network. This is an example of sort of where we're trying to get smart, alluding to Massachusetts specifically. Here's what our real maps look like today. So you can see a couple things. It's hard to say a zip code is covered because truly we're a lot more hyperlocal than that. Some zip codes are partially covered. Some are covered some days of the week, but the store might be closed on Sunday. We have stores that have elected not to deliver to Boston College and whatever this college is right here because they don't want sort of the hassle and liability of delivering to college students. And you can sort of see that when you take a bunch of these sort of small little polygons and add them up, that kind of looks like what we're showing for all of Massachusetts here. So as you can see, there's a lot of red on this map. The green, there are a lot more green points that sort of overlap on each other. But it just kind of goes to show that, people browse for alcohol delivery all over, and we truly need to figure out our supply at this hyperlocal level. And then here's some of the strategic partnerships that I've talked about. The alcohol industry has this 3-tier regulation where if you manufacture alcohol, you can't sell it, you can't distribute it. And if you distribute alcohol, you can't sell it to an end consumer. So to a large extent, Budweiser does not know where a can of Bud Light goes, and at the end of the day, who purchased it and for how much, and whether it's the first time they purchased it or not. Some anecdotal things to just show how different the world of Drizly is. on Drizly, Bullet Rye sells more than Jack Daniels. In the offline world, Jack Daniels outsells Bullet by more than 25-1. So these are just things where we think the future of alcohol will be to a much larger extent online. And there are a lot of trends that we see in our data that we think are leading indicators of what's going on with the rest of the market. And I will let Dennis take over from here about sort of where we were before Snowflake and what we're trying to solve with it.
Hi, I'm Dennis. I'm on the analytics team. So just kind of want to talk about how we migrated over to Snowflake, and going to do this pretty high level so we can save some time for questions at the end. But some of our pain points before moving to Snowflake were not really being able to handle semi-structured data in our data warehouse. And this just made it so that we kind of had to have logic throughout our pipeline in order to parse out data. Besides that, we were kind of constrained by just the limits on our warehouse. It was not the most flexible, and there was we weren't able to really scale up compute if we needed to do a backfill or any real expensive operations. Kind of going off the first point, there wasn't always the closest ties between data and the logic, so we couldn't always tell what was being processed where. We didn't really have a great testing environment. Sharing data with external customers, which Ian was talking about, was always kind of an ordeal. And we just, again, had data in too many places and logic scattered around, so it was really hard to tell where the correct answers for things were. So this is what our stack looked like before Snowflake. We had our BI tool talking to Redshift and some of our data sources loading into Redshift, but we also had our BI tool talking directly to some of those external sources. So this is kind of where logic being scattered about started to become a problem. So going forward, what we did was we tried to centralize our logic around dbt, which is this open source tool that allows you to kind of manage your data models and deploy them as DAGs just in a really simple SQL-based way, and it tries to be agnostic on the back end so you can switch out your warehouses pretty easily. So this is kind of what we were aiming for, of bringing in all of our sources just into our data warehouse with an ETL service. We're using Fivetran, and then managing all of our logic in one place with dbt, and then having our BI tool only talk to Snowflake rather than having it talk to data sources directly. So this makes it easier to just kind of hold all of our logic in one place. Very high picture, this is what our stack looks like, kind of centered around Snowflake. In the ingestion layer, you can see that we have our external sources being brought in through Fivetran, but for some of our internal sources that already are writing to S3, we just bring those in with Snowpipe. We have that load in a very unprocessed format in a database we call raw, which just has no transformations on it at that level. We then have a warehouse dedicated just to running our dbt job. And so this makes sure that all of our analysts have just one place where they're applying logic for all of our data, and that there's scheduled runs of that push our final curated, tested models into a database called prod, which is the only thing our BI tool and and all of our external users use for driving decisions. Then some of the kind of cool Snowflake specific features that we're taking advantage of, you can see these staging databases, which are Snowflake zero-cost clones. So this allows us to, in about 45 seconds, clone our production database and then be able to run dbt jobs against those clones just for testing purposes, so we can see how a model runs when we make a change. Then we can run our same unit tests and everything against those clones before we feel confident pushing it into prod. The other thing we're taking advantage of are reader accounts. You can see those at the bottom. So for all of our external users that want to look at their data, we can just set up a zero-cost reader database that is just a mirror of production. So we don't have to worry about exporting data or making sure other databases are in sync. Everything that they see is a reflection of what's happening in prod, which is pretty nice. So yeah, after Snowflake, I would say the adoption has been pretty seamless. We've been able to get a lot of people at Drizly up and running on it, and it's been a pretty easy tool to just kind of dive into. We've had a lot of different teams, such as marketing, where this quote comes from, but also product and engineers just being able to dive in and kind of make sense of the data. So it's been really nice to just kind of open up our data sources and just make this more of a communal project, so everyone can kind of track down logic that's pertains to themselves and being able to see just how their calculations are made, rather than it being kind of obscured by lots of layers of parsing and loading. So it's been a pretty easy adoption, and yeah, we're looking forward to kind of going forward with all this. So leave it open for questions.
So Daniel, I see that there's some Q&A questions. Yep. Should we just start diving in?
Yeah. So let me just remind people, folks, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll just go through this and throw them at Ian and Dennis. But yeah, let's start tackling those questions. So I see here, there's one interesting question here that asks, how are you collecting the inventory of the stores in real time? And do you have some sort of a connection at each of the liquor stores?
Absolutely. So I can take that one. The answer is it's very complex. So our liquor stores range from mom and pop bodegas in New York City that to a large extent, almost do the equivalent of like tying a USB to a carrier pigeon and mailing it to us, where their data is, not that trustworthy. It might come in an Excel file. We might get it as a CSV, all the way up to sort of massive billion-dollar chains like Specs and ABC, where they have an absolutely incredible point of sale, industry standard. So we get about 14 million points of data per hour that I would say we kind of trust with like a variety. I don't know. It's a little bit of everything. So, for example, I'd say we almost have like a two-stage machine learning model, where the first stage says, should we even try to match this to an alcohol item? And then the second item, sorry about that. And then the second stage would basically be saying, which alcohol item is this? So, for example, a store in Florida might say, we have a Bud Light 6-pack, sunscreen, Corona 12-pack, and tennis balls. So the first stage would sort of say, let's only try to match the Bud Light and the Corona to something in our catalog. The second stage would say, let's map it to this actual item that we kind of have an inventory understanding of. But generally, it's like a very, very tough process. And to a large extent, we would say some of our core intellectual property, we worked pretty hard on making it so that any store in the US and Canada can get their inventory on pretty quickly.
Nice. Here, there's another question that asks, what were you using as your data warehouse solution before Snowflake? And I think you mentioned in one of those slides, I think it was Redshift. Was that the solution?
Yeah, I can take this one. So before Snowflake, we used Redshift, and we also used Domo, but I would kind of say that we used Domo for too much than we should have. Domo has these connectors built in, which lets you do, ETL from other sources. But what it meant is that to too much of an extent, we were using Domo as a data lake, and we had stuff in Domo that did not live in Redshift. So kind of as we moved on to Snowflake, we also decided, let's have Snowflake be our landing spot where all of our raw data lands. And if it doesn't make it in there, analytics won't report on it.
Nice. And have you seen expansion in terms of the number of users using Snowflake, like a before and a after? More people from more departments using it, or no?
Absolutely. And I think that has less to necessarily do with interest and more to do with the fact that given Redshift's concurrency issues and the fact that you can't scale up and down, it was just something we weren't comfortable exposing to the rest of the company the way we are with Snowflake.
Perfect. Another question here is, so is asking about the Snowpipe process. So as soon as Snowpipe auto ingests into your raw database, how can a dbt code automatically pull that data and move it further?
So we are using Snowpipe for auto ingest, and so as files kind of hit S3, they're automatically copied into Snowflake. dbt is kind of a separate process that runs on its own schedule. So regardless of the rate that things are ingested with Fivetran or Snowpipe, which can be very different depending on the source, dbt just always runs at set times. So we just have set times in the day that we build all of our data models or parts of our data models.
Okay. There's also a question about this process of raw staging production, and he's asking, how many Snowflake accounts are you using for that?
So we have only one account. We have our main production account. I would say the only thing I would say that are different accounts are our reader accounts that we use for external sharing. But we only have really our one production account, but we do have multiple databases and warehouses, kind of for what Ian was saying of, we really want to be able to independently scale any of these processes. So if for whatever reason we have more users pinging Snowflake, we can scale that up even if it means that our load isn't any different, so we can keep that process the same. But so we have, roughly speaking, about like kind of 3 warehouses, one for ingestion, one for transformation, one for reporting, and roughly 3 different databases of raw production and the clones of staging, or the clones of prod.
And all of that is all within your one production account, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. There's now a question about how would you compare implementing your dimensional model in Redshift versus Snowflake?
So I think the biggest difference is just the fact that since Snowflake has support for semi-structured data, we can have all of our logic for modeling exist in one place, rather than before we would kind of have to apply some of that logic upstream so it could be loaded into tables. But in Snowflake, we can just load JSON as like a single column variant and then just parse things out as needed, which just makes things a lot easier, and it makes things a lot more, that we can be a lot more agile in how we approach data modeling.
Gotcha. Another question is asking, do you have any CI/CD solution implemented?
Yeah, we have an automatic build of our dbt project. So whenever an analyst pushes a PR to master, a new image of our dbt project is built. So whenever the next dbt run happens, it just reflects whatever's in master. So we don't have to worry about any real deploys or anything, that we can just do all of our testing on one of those clone staging databases. And once everything is pushed out through a PR, everything will be reflected in the next run.
Cool. Does your website use Snowflake as the back end?
So currently, no. We're kind of working more about getting to the point that Snowflake or data models that we create in Snowflake can be used by other services, but we're still figuring out kind of the best caching layers to put in between those. We still don't want too many production APIs to ping Snowflake directly.
Nice. So this question, I think, is related to, as you were talking about data sharing, and is asking, has Drizly leveraged the Snowflake data exchange?
We have not. We have actually looked at the Snowflake Data Exchange more in terms of us consuming data. I think we would be interested in things like zip code level data, weather level data. We know that people pick up Drizly a lot more often when the weather's bad or if it's cold out. In terms of the data that we would share externally, I think that's one where we would probably be a little bit more precise on it, and sort of work with our strategic partners directly, and make sure we have a solution that makes sense for them, as opposed to just sort of saying like, this data is out there for anyone who wants it. I think I would also just add, it is a regulated industry and a regulated space. So, we try to be a very good steward of both our customers' data as well as our retail store data. We never disclose individual transaction level data, any customer data, or data that can be sort of like mapped back to any individual store.
Yeah, and I think just taking a couple of seconds here for those on the call who are not familiar with the Snowflake Data Exchange, from this question is just a data marketplace that all Snowflake users have access to source external and third-party data, like such as Ian said, like weather data, financial data, zip code data, demographics, etc. And people can also, and other companies can participate and publish their own data sets in the data exchange if they so wish to do so. Is asking here, the next question is if any changes were required in the source system table structure for the new ELT tool to work.
So not really. Syncing over some of our internal databases, like our transaction MySQL database, was kind of the same as it exists in Redshift, which made the transition pretty easy. Kind of already made this point, but I would say the biggest difference is that we just have the ability to bring in more source tables into Snowflake and in formats that just weren't supported in our old system. So that's probably the biggest change, is that we can just have more of our sources exist in the same environment as our data warehouse.
Yeah, I would echo that and say the only major changes we needed to make with our code were taking complex lines of JSON extract and regex for JSON blobs in Redshift, which it does not natively support, and just converting those to sort of like the really, really friendly Snowflake JSON extracts.
Cool. So here's, they were asking, what was the transition like moving from your previous architecture to Snowflake? I'm trying to gauge both the transition process and the adoption of the new technology. So can you walk us through a little bit of what that process was like?
Yeah, I think it went pretty smoothly. We started by just figuring out what are the most pressing data sources that we would need from kind of day one in order to move reporting to Snowflake. So started off with that transaction MySQL database and kind of our core third-party applications, getting those in Snowflake. A big thing that helped with the transition again was dbt. We already had some of our logic for our Redshift models exist in dbt, and then switching that over to point at Snowflake instead is pretty easy, of just changing your backend connection. So that was kind of the place to start, and with bringing in those main sources and transferring over those main data models, that takes you 70% of the way there, and then you're just filling in the gaps of those other third-party sources that you need or ones that you always hope to be bringing in. So we had both running in production for a while, but now more and more just Snowflake is powering the majority of our analytics.
I might just add to that, we did a lot of stuff all at once, which I think wouldn't necessarily be what I would have assumed we would have done going in, but I think we just kind of realized that at a certain point, the way we were doing things currently just wasn't going to allow Drizly to grow. We were running into concurrency issues. We just had so much ad hoc work. So we basically made the choice to adopt Fivetran Snowflake, and dbt all pretty quickly. And then instead of sort of swapping out one piece for another, just sort of said, like, what is the data architecture that we want? And we built that, and basically just sort of said, like, we're just not going to really support that much net new stuff for Drizly until we're cut over to the view of the world that we want to have.
And there are now some questions here, a few different people asking about data volumes. Can you talk about what are you guys seeing, like, from a daily data ingest, and how much data do you have total in Snowflake?
So our volume isn't huge. I would say our biggest single table is probably 1.5 terabytes. The thing that makes, so our ingestion isn't that much of a problem. What makes it hard is that we have to do these exploding joins a lot to show not just what someone purchased at a given time, but every option of what they could purchase at a given time. So we end up storing a lot more data in our data models than actually exists in our raw sources. So that's one thing that just kind of makes it another thing that's just helpful for Snowflake is doing backfills on some of those larger models can be time consuming, but we can just size up the warehouse we're using to run those models, and just for a day run something on a 2XL just so it can finish in 6 hours, and then going forward it will only take 5 minutes because it's only processing 1 day of data going forward.
And just to reiterate sort of why we need this from a business use case, it's because when someone enters an address, we convert that to a lat long, look it up against a polygon of stores, check to see which stores are open, and check to see which items we believe those stores have in inventory, which means that if someone moves 400 feet left or right, they might just have an entirely different set of inventory available. So we need to be able to track how someone does in terms of conversion, average order value, what they add to cart against sort of the options they had available. And all of this changes basically for every single lat long that enters Drizly on a daily basis.
Nice. There's a few different questions here, but overall around the same theme about data security. And if you can talk about your experience implementing privacy security overall within Snowflake.
Yeah. So a lot of that just has to do with a big benefit of Snowflake is being able to have these separate databases and warehouses set up for just different workflows. So one thing that's just very important with all this is securing down our environments to make sure that only the users that should be doing that process have access to that data. So our analysts, I should say our internal users all the way upstream can't, for the most part, query the raw database. We don't really want them to. Our analysts can, and our dbt tasks can. So our dbt tasks can go in and look at all of our raw data and then build it into data models that then are materialized in that prod database, which those users then can view. So I think a really important thing with Snowflake and getting up to speed with it is just figuring out which services you want to do which tasks, and kind of just scope down user roles to be as minimal as possible.
Good. One of our final questions now, as we're running out of time, there's some questions about Domo, as you're talking about, was one of your components of the previous architecture. Are you still using Domo, or was Domo not able to process the data? Why did you move away from Domo?
So I can speak to that one. I would just say that we were using Domo for the wrong thing, right? So it should be a visualization layer similar to Tableau, to Mode, to Looker, and we were using it as a connector because it has these built-in connectors to Google Analytics and Salesforce and things like that. We were using it as a source of our data logic. So because we had some of this Salesforce and Google Analytics and Google Ads data only living in Domo, we needed our business logic to also live in Domo. So it was not version controlled. It was not searchable. It was really hard to tell the lineage on anything. We had probably, I'm not actually exaggerating, when you typed in attribution, you got something like 600 cards and 120 data sets. So it's just something that really didn't lend itself to kind of growing with the rest of the team. So I would say, in my experience, kind of like Domo, the visualization layer is fine. What we were using it for is not. So we are still using Domo, but to a large extent, a lot of our projects right now are sort of saying, let's take this business critical logic that only lives in one place and start to pull it back into the land of dbt and Snowflake.
Nice. Another one of our final questions, I think, is going to be also about the data sharing component that you mentioned. How were you doing that before Snowflake, and how has that changed with Snowflake?
So before Snowflake, we just kind of had a lot of back and forth with external IT departments of setting up usernames and passwords and SFTP servers and IP whitelists, and just making any new or adding a new external customer was just a lot of work, and a lot of work on things that really we shouldn't have to go through for like every new customer. So with using data sharing, we actually have to deploy this, we use Terraform. So it's very easy to, one, keep all of our sharing accounts just in version control. And then if we need to add an additional sharing account, it's very easy to just add that to our Terraform and then deploy it and manage all of those extra accounts through that. So it's been just very easy to set up a new customer in 15 minutes as opposed to 2 weeks.
Wow, nice. Thank you for that. Well, I guess we're out of time. So that basically wraps up our office hours. So big thanks to Ian, Dennis, and Drizly for the great content. And thank you so much for the audience for your great questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to answer your question. Feel free to reach out to us. If you have additional ones, be happy to forward those over to the Drizly team, help connect you guys. And as a reminder, this whole session is being recorded right now, and it's going to be made available. And you should get a link, and it's also going to be uploaded to our Office Hours YouTube channel. With that, I will see you at the next Office Hours in about 2 weeks' time. And in the interim, I would encourage all of you to please visit snowflake.com, learn more about us, and see our case studies, videos, online demos, and also on the homepage, you can sign up for a free 30-day trial of Snowflake. Again, Ian, Dennis, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for your time. Goodbye.
Thanks all.